Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a custom sword from Purna Dranal, graciously on loan from sword friend Daniel. And before I get into the review, some caveats and disclaimers. One, sword friend Daniel would like his property back in one piece, so I do not have license to destroy this sword, which is my typical shtick on YouTube. I will, however, push it a bit. Sword friend Daniel gave me the okay to whack it around a little bit, and so I will do that, and you will get to see the results of that. Also, do know that I didn't spend any money on it. It's not mine. Somebody else put it together, graciously loaned it to me. If you think that impedes my bias or something, I suppose you at least know the conditions at the start. The other bit is that I do not study historic European martial arts. I study other kinds of swordsmanship, but not that one, and so I don't effectively know how to use this sword in context, even though it's kind of a fantasy-esque sword, so I digress. Point is, it'll be obvious when you see me move it around. With that in mind, what is the point of this video? So the idea here is to show you, if you give Purna Dranal very detailed instructions, which sword friend Daniel did, and you have an idea in your head that you would like to see realized, and you choose to commission Purna to do that work, what can you expect, and is it worth your money? And so hopefully you'll have an answer to that by the end of this video, or at least an idea anyway. So I'll show you high-res photos, I'll talk about bits and bobs and fits and features, give my best idea of what sword friend Daniel was trying to accomplish and how Purna Dranal realized it or made it, and then I'll cut with it. I'll talk about the experience of moving it around, and then I'll wrap it up and tell you if I think it's worth it or not, but hopefully by that point you'll know for yourself anyway. Anyway, that's the idea. On with the review. So first things first, how much was the sword? It was $1,600 after shipping. That is what sword friend Daniel said he put into it, but I don't think that really covers all the things he put into it. Sword friend Daniel also provided a really excellent schematic for Purna to follow, a roadmap to make him happy, and not every customer does that. I think a lot of people, when they commission a sword, probably have some idea of what they want in their head, but conveying that in a way that the smith understands and can realize is not necessarily as clear as, or at least I've never provided a roadmap in the same way. So a very specific set of instructions was provided to Purna, and if you have an idea in your head, I think it's fair to say if you want the result to be as close as it was here, that you'll have to provide similarly specific instructions or ideas or maps or details or schematics, etc. It's also worth noting that what do you get for that $1,600? Because it's not nothing. You certainly are in the high-end sword territory, but when it comes to commissioned pieces that are one of a kind, particularly with the level of detailing and embellishment that this has in a scabbard, it's really not all that expensive. It's probably towards the more budget-conscious or entry-level price point that you can get a sword like this made. Now, there really isn't another sword like this that you can go buy. You can get a claymore, something with maybe a similar crossguard. You can get something maybe with a similar pommel or a scabbard or a type 18, but nothing that quite looks like this, and that's purposeful. Sword friend Daniel was thinking of the Narsil, Alexandria, Anduril sword from Lord of the Rings, the Monasterevin sword. I'm probably saying that wrong. Monasterevin. I'm definitely saying it wrong. Anyway, a historic sword that has a really unique hilt as well as a type 18 blade. He was trying to make an amalgamation or some sort of combination that took influence from all three of these types of swords, and I think he certainly did that really well. It's a much better balanced fantasy piece than I was honestly expecting, but I'll talk about that when I get to the dynamics. The point is that you certainly get something bespoke for that money, and honestly $1,600 is not a huge amount of money when you factor in that it's a custom one-of-a-kind piece and a more ornate one than is typical. All right, so I'm going to start with the pommel, the wheel at the base right here, and the first thing I want to call out is that I see imperfections everywhere, and I see it all over the sword, frankly. So I want to call it out here that there isn't really a square inch on this sword that is perfect. I don't necessarily think that's fair to expect at $1,600, but I think that's a lot of money, and a lot of people are going to expect perfection, fair or not. And in this case, if you don't like asymmetry, you don't like kind of the human basic tool look, some sort of ruggedness, if you're expecting machine perfection, then this is not going to be for you. And it's everywhere, and I don't want to harp on it all the time. I'll call it out where it seems particularly egregious or odd, but anyway, it's worth noting that as you see it in the high-res video, it's just about everywhere. So if I don't call it out specifically, I'm calling it out now that it's everywhere. Anyway, that said, what I do see here is a blackened pommel with a gold set of detailing, some lettering, and some symbols. The pommel as well, I don't think was supposed to be sloped, but it does seem like it has dimension and texture, and that Purna followed the roadmap pretty well. If I look at what was expected and what was delivered, it's pretty close, and honestly most of the sword seems pretty close to what was laid out. It's not all exactly as laid out, but it's generally speaking pretty close. So other details here, it's blued or blackened in some way. The lettering is quite clear, but one side of the pommel does have a smudge that doesn't appear perfect, and I don't think it was from use. I'm guessing it came that way from Purna or rubbed off in shipping. I'm not entirely sure. The gold detailing, I'm not sure how well durable it is, frankly. From the little bit of handling that I've moved around, it doesn't appear to rust. It doesn't appear to stain easily. It doesn't appear to rub off easily anyway, but I'd venture a guess with lots and lots of usage that may change over time. The edges are chamfered or at least rounded in such a way where none of them are particularly sharp, and they're also crisp at the same time. You can make out kind of some tool markings underneath the blackening, but overall it's reasonably well executed and pretty close to what was suggested on the roadmap from Swordfriend Daniel. The peen at the end here is a little odd, though. The peen is very small, and so I have some concerns that maybe it's not robust enough to hold the pommel on if you impact a large swing or over time. It's also a little bit sharp. It has some ledges on here, and I think it could be smoothed over a little better. It's not bad, but I can kind of get my skin to catch just a little bit, and that's not ideal. Now, I can kind of understand why it's not more ground down than it is, because it would be very easy to, I think, diminish the patina that's been put on here, the coloring, with a hammer, a misplaced hammer strike, or trying to file it down and missing with your file. So I'm thinking this was good enough and was left alone without kind of buffing it down more. But I'd like to see personally a more robust peen. That's just me, though. The last thing I'd like to call out about the pommel is where it meets this metal section of the grip. And more or less, I don't see this on the initial design, but I do think this was a solid addition from Purna. I like the execution one. It doesn't necessarily blend as well potentially as it could. It's a little bit rough. At the same time, by having the pommel rest in these shoulders, it doesn't give it an opportunity to twist around at all. So where I was concerned about having a relatively small and perhaps weaker than it could be peen, these shoulders really keep the pommel locked in, and it's going to keep it from twisting around or loosening, or at least make it a lot less likely. So I don't see it on the initial design from Swordfriend Daniel, but if this was an audible called by Purna, then I happen to like the execution and how it looks here. And I also think it fits better than it could otherwise. If the pommel was just I guess if the metal bit was going into the pommel, it would probably become really, really narrow and perhaps uncomfortable. This gives it enough size, and also it's not uncomfortable on my hands or fingers, and I think it makes it relatively secure. There's probably a few different ways to achieve the same goal, but I think this keeps it looking handsome and also is comfortable and ergonomic. Now I'm going to talk about the grip, and the first part I'm going to talk about is this blackened metal section here. So a solid metal grip. I don't know if it's actually solid or hollow in some way, but it feels pretty solid anyway. The point is, though, that it is a metal grip, or at least the bottom half of the grip is metal. I've seen this design on a few swords, and it's not particularly common in the reproduction market. I don't know how common it was historically, but I've certainly seen swords that have similar-esque style grips. This is octagonal, or 8 facets are running along the sides of the grip, and it's very handsome looking. I do think that the lines wander a little bit. At the same time, they're crisp enough for me to make out, but you can kind of see some of them wander around in some of the same tool markings. Where it meets the leather portion of the grip is also not particularly great. There's little bits of nubbin and stuff that stick out. I think that the finish work around here could be a little better, so that either the leather consistently overlapped or the metal consistently overlapped, or ideally it was just nipped and tucked a little bit more tidily. At the same time, nothing is uncomfortable or anything about it. It's not so sharp or bad or anything like that anything from a user perspective is uncomfortable. It's worth noting, though, that if you hold the metal grip, it certainly turns easy in your hand. Sometimes I think that can be helpful if you're trying to adjust your grip or move around. You can kind of freely move that around and twist it in your hand comfortably. But if you're trying to hold it there and you really white knuckle it and hold tight, the sword will still turn around. It's not hard to grip, but it certainly doesn't give you a very solid purchase. If you're just using that to reinforce your grip with your right hand, which is holding the leather portion, then not a problem. But if you're, for whatever reason, only holding the bottom part, it's a little slippery. With a wet hand, with a glove, if I wasn't wearing a glove made of sandpaper, I think I wouldn't be able to get a really rock solid grip where it wouldn't move. By contrast, the leather grip is a little bit different, and it looks like the 8 facets were part of the design, and the leather was part of the design, and the shape was also mapped out by Swordfish Daniel and was, it looks like, reasonably achieved by Purna. There's not a lot of dimension here in the rest of the grip, and I don't think the schematic that Daniel provided calls for it. It does grip well, it indexes well. There is also a stitched side on one, which incidentally, the way where the stitches rest on one end and where the stitches rest on the scabbard is made, is sided, I guess. The blade fits in the scabbard one way better than the other, and the stitches have to go on the opposite ends in order for the blade to feel really good in the scabbard. So that's one odd bit about the stitching. The map that Swordfish Daniel put out looks a little different than what was here with the stitches, but I would say it's comfortable. The stitching doesn't bite into my hands. If I hold the sword, it locks in pretty tight. If I hold it really tight, it doesn't twist very easily, even though I can get a lot of leverage with these quillets. I tend to hold the sword in one hand, really white knuckle it, then see if I can twist it with the quillets. I can here, but not easily. It feels like it locks in pretty well, and that was my experience. I felt really connected to the sword while I was swinging it around. The leather portion of the grip, apart from the stitching and where it meets the metal portion of the grip, it overall looks nice. I like kind of the blotchiness. I can understand why this would not be ideal if you were looking for one uniform color, but there's kind of darker and lighter shades to the red, which, if you're okay with some of the imperfections, some of the irregularities and erraticness of coloring and whatnot, I think it really adds to the overall look to have this kind of dynamic coloring in the grip. Anyway, some parts are lighter than others. Overall, it indexes well. It feels pretty good, and naturally, the leather on the grip that is dyed matches the leather on the scabbard that is dyed. And similarly, the scabbard has color variations in it that are similar to the grip. Tasteful, though. I kind of like the organicness of it. Where the grip meets the crossguard, it's really well finished. I can make out some what appear to be glue or some sort of residual resin, but not a lot of it. Overall, I would say it's really well fit on there. There's no overlap of a lip or anything like that, and overall it seems pretty clear and well done, in contrast to the other side where it meets the metal bit on the grip. The crossguard. Now again, the design is mapped out by Swordfish Daniel. It bears a striking similarity to something that you might have seen on a claymore. It has these lobes at the end that are gold in coloration. The rest of it is blackened, and it has kind of dimension and whatnot to it. So the edges are rounded in. They're almost hexagonal in shape, but almost rounded. The lobes have 5 holes punched in them, and I don't know if the sword that Swordfish Daniel was looking at has that. There's like a colored background, but I can't tell if the lobes are actually have holes drilled in them or not, or if it's just not embellished with gold detail on it. I can't exactly tell by the picture. Anyway, the point is that it has a claymore-esque kind of look to it, and it's overall quite handsome. It's also feels pretty good. If I choke up on the grip, nothing bites into me, nothing hurts. It's overall reasonably comfortable to hang on to. And given the way you move in a Type 18C, I don't find that the size of these lobes or how large the crossguard is really impairs movement at all. It looks very visually stunning, and from a user perspective, it's still pretty comfortable. All right, moving on to the scabbard. Well, the scabbard, as I noted earlier when I was talking about the grip, has one way that it fits in. And granted, I can put it in either way. I can match the stitched sides, but then it doesn't quite line up, and there's more gaps that I'm able to see. And it certainly fits better in the scabbard in one direction. Unfortunately, then the stitched end has to be on the opposite end of where the other stitched end is, and that makes it seem strange to me. But apart from that, the scabbard seems really well made. It's not easy to draw. It's not hard, I should say, to draw the sword. At the same time, it doesn't fall out. It's covered in leather. It's stitched along one edge, and it has kind of golden embellishments on it, little ringed sections for you to attach, presumably, a belt. And on these sections, there is, I'm not exactly sure how Purna put it in here, if it's pressed in or if it's brazed on. I'm not quite sure, but there's some sort of decoration or ornateness that went on each little piece of the scabbard, as well as on the chape. On the bottom, there's a decoration here that was outlined by Swordfish Daniel, and it is on the chape. Now, these are the roughest looking in terms of ornateness. There's rather intricate cross patterns and some ornate detail here, and it's a little bit on the rough looking side. At the same time, it's bespoke and unique, and I could certainly see, for example, if I were to have similar fittings made. I've had fittings made for Japanese style swords, and if I want some very elaborate carving and I want it to be very clean and pristine, it's not crazy that like $1,600 may only cover the cost of the scabbard fittings to do that kind of level of ornate work, or maybe it would be even more than that just to have scabbard fittings made. And remember, you're getting a whole sword with scabbard and some detail. So the fact that it's on here at all and that attempts are made to embellish it as much as have been is really frankly impressive. They're also on here and pretty solid. They don't move around. I know it's probably catching in my microphone a little bit, but these pieces don't move. And very often I've seen scabbard fittings where they're not attached particularly well. These seem really solidly on here. So the scabbard as well seems pretty well built. It's a little bit on the thicker side, but not grotesquely so. All right, now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part. And there's really a lot to unpack here. Purna did a lot of stuff. There's a lot of really good stuff here, and a lot of it was mapped out from Sword Friend Daniel, who provided, again, a schematic with dimensions and cross-section measurements and how big everything should be and where. And I think Purna did a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close to what was mapped out. In the base here, there's a hexagonal cross-section where there's a flat that rises up, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches, somewhere in there, but it tapers up a little bit past this point, where it tapers down a little bit past this point above the crossguard area here. So a little bit wider and thicker cross section here. I like that design. This is a weak point of sword sometimes, so a little bit more meat down here I appreciate, particularly where the tang runs down. I think that's a smart choice. It then goes into a diamond cross section that has a profound amount of profile as well as distal taper, and both seem executed pretty well. The sword is really sharp. I'm hesitant to touch it or handle it at all. It is very sharp. And I don't know if that was in the specification, but it certainly is the case. It's also hollow ground. Now, if I look down the planes of the blade, there's a really substantial amount of surface ripples. In the previous example of a Purna Dranal blade that I had did not have as many. This has quite a bit more kind of hammer marks or signs of being kind of pounded out and handmade. Sword Friend Daniel noted he likes this. It's a facet of Purna's construction that he enjoys, or at least doesn't mind. It's just worth noting that they're there. The rest of it, the lines on it, the central ridge is reasonably crisp. It runs down in the right spot. It's slotted in the guard evenly, and it overall seems to follow Sword Friend Daniel's design pretty well. Now, in terms of moving it around, in terms of dynamics, measurements and all that kind of stuff are in the description down below, but it's worth noting this feels really good in the hand. I believe point of balance, or at least some expectation in balance, may have been provided in Sword Friend Daniel's schematics. I'm not sure if those were or not. But you see it inherently when you see a fantasy sword, when you see something with all this metal on it. I was expecting something that was going to feel cumbersome and dumpy in the hand. A lot of fantasy blades get overbuilt. It's very easy to break blades when you make them as light as this, or heat treat them poorly, and so often I think they get overbuilt and they feel kind of clubbish in the hands. This doesn't. It feels like a Type 18C sword. I've tested a number of them. I'll provide measurements as well for some of the other Type 18C swords that I've had, just so you can compare it to some of the other Type 18C blades that I've had, and you can see that it fits within the realm of point of balance. It fits within the realm of measurements. And it feels like that. I can hold it in one hand, I can move it around. It certainly feels like it's a little bit more designed to be moved in two hands, but the point of balance doesn't make it exceedingly difficult to move in one hand. And it certainly is very wide, thin. It doesn't feel like it's going to be super great in the thrust because it's not super rigid, but at the same time in the cut, it seems to feel like it's really easy to index, lock on. It's easy to get the edge where you want it to be. It's not a slouch with getting the point where you want it to be either, but I certainly think that it favors choppy, cutty stuff. Anyway, speaking of that, because dynamics, I don't move it around. For whatever it's worth, there's measurements that are probably more useful, but to me it feels like a Type 18C sword, or similar within the ballpark of other Type 18C swords, probably favoring the lighter, more nimble of them, if not the more light and nimble, the nimblest of them anyway. what I can say is cutting was an absolute blast. This moves through targets really, really well. With pool noodles, it pops them apart. Now, a pool noodle, it really just takes a really keen edge, and sometimes you can get by with a less than keen edge. If you have great edge alignment and good power, it can still pop a pool noodle apart, but it's certainly harder to do. With a really keen edge like this sword has, it really pops them apart. You don't have to swing hard, you don't have to swing much, and it just laser beams through the pool noodles. That's what this did. It cut extremely well. I found it to be very enjoyable to move around. You didn't have to do much. It was more like dancing with the sword, cutting a pool noodle. It was an enjoyable experience, which isn't something that I've had recently with pool noodles, so it was fun to experience. Cutting the water bottles as well, also very fun. Now, this has a very, very keen edge, and it cut through water bottles just fine, but there was one cut in particular where I took the sword with and just kind of quickly slapped it down the middle of a water bottle, into the neck, and through the neck of the water bottle into the rest of the water bottle. And it did it. It cut the cap in half, it cut right through the neck, it popped right back out. The water bottle was left there standing, and it really impressed me that it did that. A lot of times it'll push them down, it won't cut all the way through, it'll splatter everywhere. This one just cut right through it. Now, there were some consequences. When I did that cut on the water bottle, I didn't notice at first, but there are some very, very minor edge rolls on the edge of the blade, and that's not uncommon when you cut a water bottle neck. Water bottle necks are much thicker plastic, and if there's a part of a water bottle that's going to damage your sword, it's usually where the cap is, where the neck is. It's thicker, it's harder, and a bad cut there or cutting right through it can do that, particularly if you have very, very fine edges like this sword has. But I would say the damage is hardly that. Like, I could probably smooth it out with a strop or with a ceramic stone or something like that. It is very, very minor. The edge held up really well to doing some of those cuts. I've taken much more expensive swords than this and pushed the edge over or damaged the edge cutting necks of water bottles. I've chipped swords doing it, so the fact that it had the most minor noticeable deflection and edge isn't something that I would say is terribly concerning, but I suppose something worth noting. When I brought it to tatami, I was able to cut and laser through tatami. It was an excellent cutter. It was the best cutting sword that I've cut with in quite some time. And of the other swords, I was cutting with katana and a number of other swords on that day. And this one is the one that stood out as the easiest. And as I mentioned, I don't study historic European martial arts. I don't cut with Type 18Cs every day. I've cut with a few of them naturally, but I don't cut with them frequently. And it was just so easy to use, a joy to use. It slashed right through them. It was giving me beautiful, clean cuts. Bad edge alignment, it really did a lot of the work for you, and the hollow grinding, however the edge is made on this, it just wanted to straighten itself out and move through targets, and it did it really, really well with just laser clean cuts on those tatami mats. It was surprising how well it cut, and it made me want to go more tatami and make some very expensive outing decision stuff, because tatami is ridiculously expensive, and it made me want to go spend $100 on tatami and enjoy that for all of 3 minutes. Anyway, point is, it cut tatami really well. It was really easy to get the edge exactly where I wanted it to deliver some good cuts. It was the best sword that I cut with on the day. The other bit is I cut some branches. It lasered through those branches. I did some bad cuts on the branches. It stayed straight. I didn't notice any edge deflection on branches. I was cutting something that was a little less than an inch in diameter. It was a green branch. I'm not noticing a lot of scuffing or scratching or problems or bending. Nothing happened from cutting through the branches that popped them apart. And then the last bit is I slapped it a little bit on the side of my stand. Now, slapping it on the side of my stand is a 6x6. It's weighted down. It's a hefty thing. And if I slap it on the corner of the stand, even a little nonchalantly as it might appear that I'm doing, that's been enough to really bend swords in the past. And so if they're not heat treated properly, it starts canting them off to the side. It's not enough where it's going to fork them over at 90 degrees, but it's where I'm going to start noticing to a repairable amount that the sword is bending and maybe soft, maybe not heat treated right. This one, I could slap it on the side of the stand without being super aggressive with it, and it certainly bends over a fair amount when I do that, and it springs back to true and doesn't seem to have any issues. So it seems heat treated reasonably well. All right, sword friends, you've heard me talk about the bits and bobs and fits and features. You've seen me cut with it. I've shared all the useful information that I can. And so hopefully it's enough for you to decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. For me personally, I would say yes. I think $1,600, you're getting a lot for a sword in this price category, especially one that's handmade and that there's not another one like it, and that has all of the elaborate kind of bluing and blackening and gold detailing and scabbard and details on the scabbard fittings and all of that. I think $1,600 is a reasonable price to pay. It's more worth it to you if you are a person with two qualifiers. One, a person that finds Purna's flaws endearing. So if you don't mind tool marks and asymmetry and kind of hammer marks and, you know, wavy lines and stuff like that, if you like that handmade aesthetic, then that's one thing that's going to make this more of a value to you. And two, if you are a person who is not going to be satiated by anything else on the market, the fact that you can go to Purna and will your idea into existence, provided a detailed enough roadmap, is awesome. There's just not another sword like this on the market, and Purna made one and made it for $1,600 with all of these details and stuff, which I think is pretty cool. Because again, I've had fittings made for Japanese swords, and one fitting could very easily cost $1,600, and it would be little and perfect and very detailed and great, but at the same time, I would have a fitting and not a whole sword with a scabbard at the end of it. So I do think if you are a person that has an idea and is willing to provide a map, and you don't mind some of the flaws that you might see in Purna's work, or rather you see them as a feature, all the more, yes, to $1,600. However, if you're a person that wants or expects machine perfection, I don't think there's an amount of money that you can throw at Purna to make that the case, and this certainly is going to be more of an irritation, regardless of how nice it cuts, or how fun it is to move around, or how closely it might resemble the idea in your head. There's still going to be off things to you that are going to bother you. But anyway, to me, I'm starting to find that aesthetic endearing. I like it here. I think the sword has character. I like that it was willed into existence, and that the amalgamation between three cool swords combined into one with a lot of thought was able to be executed and now exists, and I got to play with it. I think it's awesome, and I really enjoyed my time with it. Anyway, hopefully my thoughts are useful. I want to offer again a special thanks to Sword Friend Daniel for lending me this sword, for sending it, and allowing me to share it with all of you. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Cheers, and thanks for watching.